It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Those who oppose Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro organized a large demonstration on Wednesday to protest against the suspension of the recall referendum process to remove President Maduro from office. In clashes with the police towards the end of the day, one police officer was shot and killed, and many protesters and police officers were injured. Government supporters also held a demonstration that same day in front of the presidential palace. However, during the opposition protest, leaders announced that they are convoking a national general strike on Friday, October 28th, and another protest is scheduled for November 3rd. Also, several opposition sectors have rejected an offer from the Vatican to mediate negotiations with the government. Joining us now to discuss the situation in Venezuela is George Ciccariello-Maher. He is an associate professor of politics and global studies at Drexel University in Philadelphia. He's the author of We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution, and the author of Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela. George, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Shamini.
So, George, the opposition is on the streets again in Venezuela to call for a presidential recall referendum, and the National Assembly that they control has announced it will hold hearings to remove the president from office. The government is calling this a National Assembly effort a legislative coup, and is comparing it to the legislative coup in Brazil, Honduras, and Paraguay. Is that comparison legitimate in your opinion?
I think the comparison is absolutely legitimate when it comes to the aspirations of these opposition legislators. Shortly after winning the National Assembly elections in December of 2015, they announced their open aspiration to remove Maduro from power. That was their primary goal, and they made it perfectly clear. And the question really remained of just how to do that. They've sought, on the one hand, the path of the referendum, although they delayed that process and are now acting as though, it's speaking as though the government is blocking that process when it's still very much a process that's moving through legal channels. And yet now we have the legislature, the National Assembly, attempting to wipe away the other branches of government. What provoked the crisis of this week is that the opposition is attempting to pass legislation that would essentially attempt to topple the government and the Supreme Court, precisely because they're frustrated that as only one branch of government, they don't control the entire government. And that really is their aspiration. Luckily, the comparison to Brazil, for example, doesn't hold up because this National Assembly simply does not have the constitutional power that it's claiming to be wielding right at this moment.
Right. So essentially, they don't have the power to remove a president from office in the case of Venezuela.
Right. They can do things like press for and provoke a recall, and they can also do things like begin impeachment proceedings. But for a lot of those processes, they actually require support within the Supreme Court.
Right. And ever since the Supreme Court suspended the recall referendum, which it was about 2 weeks ago now, the opposition has said that Venezuela is a dictatorship. They have said this before, but now they're getting backing from OAS, the Secretary General in particular, Luis Almagro. And of course, the Washington Post also carried out an article recently reinforcing that position. What do you say about this claim about Venezuela being a dictatorship?
Well, we should be clear that these are, firstly, these are many of the same people who have been saying that Venezuela is a dictatorship for many years now. In other words, in the face of free and fair and clean elections that they have repeatedly lost, the opposition wants to cry dictatorship. When you look at, for example, the Washington Post piece this week, very controversial, claiming it's a dictatorship, it's written by an opposition ideologue, and so that's no surprise. But the reality is the word dictatorship has meaning, right? It doesn't mean not going along with the dictates of the National Assembly. And yet from the very beginning of the Assembly's tenure, at the beginning of the year, every time the Supreme Court, for example, has quite legally struck down legislation, they've claimed that that this points toward a dictatorship. Now there's this cry of dictatorship. Luis Almagro of the Organization of American States very controversially tried to invoke the Democratic Charter months ago, long prior to this particular crisis. And so here is someone who has been going above and beyond his own stature within the Organization of American States to claim that there has been a rupture of the constitutional order in Venezuela, when, to be clear, Venezuela has gotten much more democratic in recent years. Millions more people can participate in elections than in recent years. The right to recall elected leaders, including the president, is only something that has existed since Chavez and since the rewriting of the Constitution in 1999. Now, the people have a right to have a recall. However, they do not have a right to, and the opposition doesn't have a right to, for example, use thousands or even hundreds of thousands of illegal signatures to start that recall. If the Chavistas attempted to use illegal signatures and the supported appeals to that, then of course the opposition would be happy. And this opposition that cries a great deal about claims that there is no independence of the judiciary is now simply attempting to ignore lower court decisions. This is what happened this week, a lower court decision pausing the recall process because of questions of illegal signatures. If you respect the autonomy of the judiciary, especially at the local level, then you would respect these appeals and allow them to run their course.
Right. Now, the opposition is calling for a general strike on Friday. Meanwhile, one of the top leaders of the Socialist Party, the PSUV, has said that businesses that closed down on Friday could be taken over by the workers. What do you make of this threat?
Well, I mean, for a long time, it's been the case that businesses that close have been reopened by the workers. This is actually one of the most heroic elements of the Bolivarian process. The last time the opposition called a so-called general strike, it was in the run-up to the 2002 coup, and then there was a so-called general strike in and around, especially the oil sector, that led to an oil shutdown. But these were never actually mass popular strikes. They were actually boss lockouts, and workers entered businesses, took them over, put them into functioning again, and some of those were taken over permanently and were expropriated as a result of the fact that you don't have, in many ways, a right in Venezuela to cease production toward political ends or to attempt to sabotage the economy, all in an attempt to remove the president from power, a president that was elected, a president that has a couple more years left in his term. There's a path for doing this. There's a constitutional path. There's a recall, and then there are elections in 2018. And so we're talking about a situation in which there are very, very clear ways to remove constitutionally a leader from power. And yet the opposition has always been torn between using the legal path and using the illegal, quasi-legal path, appealing to the military for a coup, for example, taking to the streets and causing death and mayhem in an attempt to destabilize the situation so much that someone steps in.
Right. Now the situation is obviously getting very intense, and President Maduro met with the Pope last week at the Vatican, and the Vatican has stepped in to assist in negotiating and mediating the situation. But several important sectors of the opposition have rejected this offer. Why are they rejecting this dialogue, and what do you think this means for the future of the Bolivarian project itself?
The Venezuelan opposition has always been torn between participating in the system and refusing that system, rejecting it. And this is another manifestation of that fundamental division. You had a really disastrous show by the opposition this week in which some of the leaders came out and often claimed that they were going to participate in him out. We never agreed to that. And the breach within the opposition is growing, not shrinking, despite the opposition, the shared opposition to the government. The reason that some don't want to participate is because they're a dictatorship. And of course, if there were really a dictatorship, they wouldn't be dialoguing with that dictator. But of course, if there were a dictatorship, they wouldn't be winning elections either. So you have the other sector that realizes that now is maybe a good opportunity to get some concessions out of the Maduro government and is attempting to dialogue to calm things down and to move toward the possibility of a referendum. but they simply can't agree on these things. But toward the broader question, this is not a good moment for the Maduro government. This is absolutely clear. The economy, precisely because of a problem within the currency control system, sort of went into a tailspin a couple of years ago, coinciding with the collapse in oil prices, and this has been very disastrous. This has happened before, and it happened in the context of another recall referendum. In 2003, for example, or 2002, President Chavez was also very unpopular because the economy was in the toilet, and the opposition used that opportunity in attempt a coup, to then attempt a recall referendum, and the government came out of those in a more stable position. If the economy returns to normal, if there's some stabilization in the macroeconomic situation, many of the people that voted for the opposition last December will come back to the side of Chavismo. But if it does not improve, of course, then you'll have a situation of continuing standoff between two increasingly unpopular forces. Maduro is certainly losing some level of support, although many millions of Venezuelans remain Chavistas, but the opposition is not gaining that support either. Because they have not shown themselves to have any kind of alternative economic or political policy for the country, and are simply trying to destabilize and to then appeal to foreign intervention.
Right. Now, George, you worked very closely on the ground with Venezuelans, particularly in the effort to create participatory democracy via the creation of communes and communal councils and so forth. How do you see this project in this moment, political moment in Venezuela?
It's important to emphasize that when we read the press accounts, we don't hear this side. In other words, between Maduro and the leadership of the opposition, what is missed is the question of the grassroots. And that's an important part of this equation, in part because these are the most solid support base that Chavismo has, precisely because they're building on the ground something incredibly revolutionary and radical. Grassroots democracy, participatory production. People are living and working and producing things that they themselves need and distributing them to the local community. Now, in the context of crisis, these sectors, of course, are suffering as well, but they also offer, in many ways, a way out. Venezuela has been for many, many years dependent on oil, which has also meant that it's been dependent on importing goods to deal with to provide people with what they need to eat, for example. And yet, the need to produce levels need that these communes are. So in the context of the crisis, while things are getting very undeniably so, while the government needs to take drastic measures, macro also needs to be greater support for these grassroots, directly democratic, self-managed communes that are producing what people need and that offer the possibility of a different kind of economy, one in which oil may be exported, but the goal is not to import luxury or consumer items. The goal is actually to have on the local level what it is that people need to eat.
All right, George, a lot more I would love to discuss with you. And the connection is a little difficult at this time, but we are hoping to have you back with a better connection real soon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.